The Blackwood estate was supposed to be the crown jewel of Oakhaven County. For over a century, the rolling hills and dense woodlands had belonged to a family of reclusive dairy farmers. Now, under the aggressive vision of Apex Development Corporation, it was destined to become Whispering Pines, an ultra-exclusive gated community boasting sprawling eco-mansions, a private golf course, and a man-made lake. But before the first foundation could be poured, before the pristine renderings could match reality, the earth itself had decided to rebel. It had been raining for 3 weeks. Not the torrential cinematic downpours that wash everything away in a day, but a steady, relentless, soul-crushing drizzle that turned the rich, loamy topsoil into a gelatinous nightmare. James Cole stood at the edge of what was designated to be Sector 4. The collar of his expensive, waterproof jacket turned up against the chill. At 28, James was a senior structural engineer whose career had been a straight, unbroken line of academic honors and high-profile urban projects. He possessed a mind that viewed the world exclusively through the lens of data, algorithms, and structural stress tests. Beside him stood Ethan Vance, the site manager, a man whose blood pressure seemed permanently tied to the delayed shipment schedules blinking on his ruggedized tablet. The telemetry from the drones said the ground saturation in this quadrant was within acceptable parameters, James muttered, tapping the screen of his own tablet. He frowned at a topographical map overlay that was supposed to be color-coded green for go, but was currently blinking a warning shade of amber. The deep soil sensors aren't matching the surface tension readouts. It doesn't make any sense. Ethan dragged a hand down his face, smearing a streak of brown earth across his cheek. I don't care what the sensors say, James. Look at it. It's not soil anymore. It's a swamp. We've got 3 dozen concrete trucks scheduled for Tuesday, and right now, a duck would sink in that. They both stared out over the expanse of mud. It was a chaotic landscape of deep, water-filled ruts, half-buried grading stakes, and the skeletal outlines of future roads. We need the main drainage trench cut before we lose the week, James said, his voice tightening. If the water pools any further toward the North Ridge, we'll trigger a localized slide and wipe out the surveying work we spent the last 10 days doing. The standard dozers can't get traction, Ethan reminded him. We nearly lost a John Deere yesterday. It took 2 other machines just to pull it back to the gravel access road. James's face broke into a thin, confident smile. He swiped to a different app on his tablet, bringing up the real-time diagnostics of Apex Corporation's newest, most expensive acquisition. That's why we didn't bring standard dozers for Sector 4. We bring in the heavy artillery. Parked on the reinforced gravel staging area, looking like a mechanical Apex Predator, was the brand-new $500,000 CAT 352 UHD excavator. It wasn't just a machine, it was a mobile supercomputer wrapped in high-yield steel and painted in flawless, glaring yellow. It boasted an autonomous traction control system, real-time ground-penetrating radar, variable power distribution, and an AI-assisted hydraulic system designed to maximize torque while minimizing energy waste. It was the absolute pinnacle of earth-moving technology. "Tell Miller to fire it up," James commanded, adjusting his pristine white hard hat. "The AI will read the mud density and adjust the track displacement automatically. That machine can walk on water if the software tells it to." A quarter of a mile away, separated by a leaning moss-covered stone wall that marked the boundary of the Apex property, a very different kind of machine was waking up. Elias Thorne, known to the younger locals simply as the Old Man, wiped a smudge of black grease from his forehead with the back of a calloused hand. He was in his late 60s, a man carved from the same stubborn, unyielding materials as the landscape he refused to leave. When Apex bought out his neighbors, Elias had flatly declined their exorbitant offers. He kept his 50 acres, his drafty farmhouse, and his workshop. Currently, Elias was entirely focused on the intricate ballet of fire, water, and iron. Before him stood the Hungry Oak, a 1920 Fowler steam traction engine. It was a massive, imposing beast of dark green iron, polished brass fittings, and wheels taller than a grown man. It looked like a locomotive that had decided to leave the tracks and conquer the fields. There were no touch screens here, no silicon chips, no telemetry, no Bluetooth diagnostics. There was only the primal physics of combustion and pressure. Elias swung open the heavy iron door of the firebox, the sudden burst of intense orange light illuminating his weathered face. He shoveled in 2 precise scoops of high-grade Welsh coal, distributing it evenly over the glowing bed of embers. He closed the door with a satisfying heavy clang and checked the brass pressure gauge. The needle was trembling, slowly climbing past 100 pounds per square inch. "Almost there, old girl," Elias murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was barely audible over the rhythmic breathing sound of the boiler. He moved around the engine with the practiced grace of a seasoned conductor. He checked the sight glass for the water level, filled the mechanical lubricators with thick, dark cylinder oil, and adjusted the governor. The smell of the machine was intoxicating to him, a rich, sharp blend of burning coal, hot oil, and wet iron. It was the scent of the Industrial Revolution, a smell that spoke of raw, unbridled power that didn't need a software update to function. As the pressure hit the operational mark, the Fowler let out a soft, hissing sigh from its safety valve, a plume of white steam mingling with the gray rain. Elias climbed up onto the steel footplate, taking his place at the controls. He engaged the gears with a heavy metallic clank, gently opened the regulator, and the massive flywheel began to turn. Chuff! 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 The sound was deep, resonant, and alive. The ground beneath the heavy steel wheels vibrated as the hungry oak rolled out of the open-sided barn, its wide, straked rear wheels biting easily into the saturated earth of Elias's property. He was heading down to his lower pasture to pull a fallen oak tree off his fence line, a route that took him parallel to the chaos of the Apex construction site. Over in Sector 4, the $500,000 Cat was making its move. The massive diesel engine roared to life, a clean, digitally optimized sound. Miller, the operator, sat in an ergonomic, climate-controlled cabin that resembled the cockpit of a spacecraft more than a tractor. Screens glowed around him, feeding him data on everything from hydraulic fluid temperature to the precise GPS coordinates of his bucket. "All right, Miller, take her straight down the center of the plotted trench line," James's voice crackled over the radio in the cab. "Keep your speed steady. Let the traction management system do the heavy lifting." "Copy that," Miller replied, pushing the drive joysticks forward. The massive yellow machine rolled off the gravel and onto the mud. For the first 50 yards, it seemed James's confidence was entirely justified. The wide steel tracks churned through the top layer of muck, the engine automatically revving to compensate for the resistance. The onboard computer rapidly shifted power between the left and right tracks, keeping the excavator moving in a perfectly straight line despite the uneven terrain. James turned to Ethan, a smug expression on his face. "See, I told you. It's all about the contact patch and the algorithm. The machine knows the mud better than the mud knows itself." Ethan nodded slowly, though his eyes remained fixed on the churning tracks. "It's moving, I'll give you that. But the soil of Oakhaven County was ancient, and it was treacherous. Beneath the soft, watery top layer lay a stratum of dense, slick blue clay. It was a geological anomaly, a layer of earth that, when saturated, possessed the frictionless qualities of wet ice and the holding power of industrial vacuum sealant. As the Cat reached the lowest point of the sector, the point where the water had pooled the deepest, it hit the blue clay. Inside the cab, a series of amber warnings flashed across Miller's primary display. Traction loss detected, slippage at 40%, recalibrating. Miller felt the subtle shift in the machine's momentum. The forward progress slowed, even as the engine pitch rose. The massive steel grousers on the tracks, designed to dig into dirt and rock, were suddenly spinning freely against the slick, impenetrable clay, acting like giant, slow-moving blenders churning the topsoil into a liquid slurry. Mr. Cole," Miller said over the radio, his voice losing its relaxed tone. "I'm losing forward momentum here. The tracks are spinning out." James scowled, staring at his tablet. "That shouldn't be happening. The slip differential is supposed to lock automatically. Push through it, Miller. Give it more throttle. Let the deep tread find the bedrock." Miller pushed the joysticks further. The massive diesel engine roared, thick black smoke puffing from the exhaust stack. The tracks spun faster, throwing rooster tails of brown sludge high into the air. But instead of moving forward, the excavator began to move downward. With every rotation of the tracks, the machine excavated the soft earth beneath it, digging its own grave. The heavy iron chassis, weighing over 50 tons, pressed down, finding no resistance from the liquid mud, only the suction of the clay below. Warning: chassis clearance compromised. Sensor obstruction. The screens in the cab flashed red. "Stop! Stop the tracks!" Ethan yelled, running toward the edge of the muck, waving his arms. Miller yanked the controls back to neutral. The engine idled down, but the damage was done. The machine didn't just stop, it settled. With a sickening wet slurp, the enormous excavator sank another 6 inches. The mud was now cresting over the top of the tracks, entirely swallowing the undercarriage. The belly of the $500,000 beast was resting flat against the earth, creating a perfect, inescapable vacuum seal. James stared at the scene, the color draining from his face. He tapped his tablet frantically, as if a software reboot could somehow reverse gravity and friction. This is impossible. The ground pressure calculations were exact, the soil density reports. Forget the reports, James, Ethan snapped, panic finally breaking through his professionalism. Look at it. It's belly deep. It's a 50-ton paperweight. Just beyond the property line, the rhythmic chuff-chuff-chuff of the hungry oak slowed. Elias Thorne brought the steam tractor to a halt near the stone wall, pulling back on the regulator. He leaned against the brass steering wheel, a scarred briar pipe clenched in his teeth, watching the disaster unfold with mild, detached interest. The contrast was stark. On one side of the wall, the pinnacle of 21st century engineering, a marvel of silicon and hydraulics, lay helpless, drowning in its own hubris. On the other side, a century-old relic of the steam age stood tall and unbothered, its massive iron wheels resting firmly on the muddy pasture, the boiler radiating a comforting, immense heat. James, desperate to salvage the situation, keyed his radio. Miller, use the boom. Plant the bucket in the dirt ahead of you and try to push yourself backward. We need to break the suction. In the cab, Miller, sweating profusely despite the climate control, manipulated the right joystick. The massive hydraulic arm extended, the heavy steel bucket crashing into the mud 20 feet in front of the cab. Okay, pulling back, Miller announced. He engaged the hydraulics, pulling the arm toward the cab while simultaneously trying to reverse the tracks. The massive cylinders whined, straining against the laws of physics. But the ground where the bucket had landed was just as compromised as the ground beneath the tracks. Instead of pulling the 50-ton excavator out of the hole, the immense hydraulic force simply dragged the bucket through the mud like a spoon through pudding, carving a deep, useless trench and pulling more water toward the trapped machine. The excavator shifted, tilting ominously by a few degrees to the left as the mud displaced. Tilt warning. Critical angle approaching. "Shut it down!" Ethan screamed over the radio. "Shut the whole thing down before you roll it, Miller. Cut the engine." Miller didn't hesitate. He slammed the emergency kill switch. The roaring diesel engine choked and died, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence over the construction site, broken only by the steady drum of the rain and the rhythmic, mocking hiss-chuff of the steam tractor idling across the wall. James stood frozen, the tablet slipping slightly in his grip. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him, bypassing his algorithms and hitting him right in the gut. The access road behind the excavator was torn to shreds. Bringing in a heavy wrecker tow truck was impossible. They couldn't get another excavator close enough without risking it getting stuck too. They were paralyzed. $500,000 of equipment, the schedule of a multi-million-dollar project, all sinking into the Oakhaven clay. "Well," a rough, amused voice called out, "looks like you boys have found yourselves a bit of a sticky wicket." James and Ethan turned. Elias was leaning over the stone wall, the smoke from his pipe mingling with the steam from his tractor. He looked entirely too comfortable. James, his pride wounded and his stress levels redlining, glared at the old man. "This is a closed, secure construction site. I suggest you move along." Elias chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "I am moving along, son. Just admiring the view from my own land." "That's a mighty pretty yellow submarine you got there. Didn't know you fellas were building a lake this far south." Ethan, usually the more diplomatic of the two, lost his temper. "We don't need jokes right now, old man. We've got a major crisis here." "I can see that," Elias said, pointing the stem of his pipe at the buried cat. "You got a machine that thinks too much and doesn't weigh enough in the right places. Spun her tracks right down to the bedrock, didn't he?" "The machine is state-of-the-art," James snapped defensively, walking closer to the wall. "It's an anomaly in the soil stratification, a completely unpredictable geological failure." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Is that what they teach you in engineering school? That the dirt is wrong? Around here, boy, the mud doesn't read blueprints. It just is." Elias took a slow puff from his pipe, his eyes scanning the distance between his steam tractor and the trapped excavator. He calculated the angle, the distance, and the depth of the mire. He knew this land. He knew what lay beneath the topsoil. "Tell you what," Elias said, his voice dropping the teasing tone, replacing it with a flat, businesslike gravel. "You boys are in a bind. You can't get a tow truck in here, and if you leave that heavy brute sitting there overnight, the water table is going to rise, and by tomorrow morning, you'll be looking at the roof of the cab. I can pull it out." For a second, the sheer silence of the rain was the only response. Then, James Cole let out a short, incredulous laugh. He looked from Elias, in his grease-stained overalls, to the 1920 Fowler steam tractor, which looked like it belonged in a sepia-toned photograph, and then back to his $500,000 trapped Titan. "You?" James scoffed, the stress manifesting as arrogant amusement. "You're going to pull out a 50-ton cat with that antique? That thing belongs in a museum. It probably doesn't have a fraction of the horsepower required to break the suction seal on that chassis." Ethan joined in, shaking his head, a nervous smile breaking through his panic. "Look, we appreciate the offer really, but that's a Class 9 excavator. It's bogged down to the axles. Well, the tracks. Your boiler there would blow a gasket trying to pull the slack out of a chain." Elias didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just looked at them with the calm, pitying expression of a man who knew a fundamental truth that the boys with the screens had yet to learn. "Horsepower," Elias said softly, "is how fast you hit the wall. Torque, gentlemen, is how far you take the wall with you when you do." He tapped the thick iron rim of his steering wheel. "The Hungry Oak here doesn't have much horsepower by your modern standards. Maybe 10, 12 on paper. But she's got a single cylinder the size of a beer keg, operating at 140 pounds of steam pressure, turning a flywheel that weighs half a ton. She doesn't slip. She pulls." James waved his hand dismissively. "It's physics, old man. You're talking about dragging 50 tons of dead weight through an active vacuum seal. Your tractor will either snap in half or dig itself into the same hole." "Suit yourselves," Elias said, turning away from the wall and putting his hand back on the regulator. "I've got an oak tree to move. I'll wave to your submarine tomorrow when I pass by." He pulled the lever. The steam hissed loudly, the flywheel began to turn, and the heavy iron machine started to roll forward, completely unbothered by the wet ground beneath it. James and Ethan watched him go. Then James looked back at his tablet. The screen was still flashing red warnings about sensor obstructions. He looked at the sky. The rain was picking up, turning into a heavy, driving sheet. He looked at the trench, which was rapidly filling with muddy water, threatening to overflow and wipe out Sector 3's foundation work. Every minute that machine sat there, Apex Corporation bled money. If it sank further, the cost of specialized recovery could run into the hundreds of thousands. His career, his flawless track record, was currently sinking into the Oakhaven mud. "James," Ethan said quietly, the mocking smile gone from his face, "he's right about the water table. If it rains like this all night, we lose the machine. Completely." James gritted his teeth, his jaw muscles jumping. He hated variables he couldn't control. He hated relying on outdated, obsolete technology. But right now, the data was clear. His state-of-the-art solution had failed, and his options had dwindled to exactly zero. "Wait!" James yelled, his voice cracking slightly over the sound of the rain and the retreating chuff of the steam engine. "Hey! Stop!" Elias pulled the regulator shut. The Fowler hissed to a halt. The old man didn't turn around, but he leaned his head slightly back over his shoulder. James swallowed hard, tasting the bitter ash of his own pride. "We don't have another option. If you think you can pull it out, we'll pay you whatever your daily rate is." Elias slowly turned around, resting his arms on the back of his steering platform. He looked at the two young engineers, standing in the mud, stripped of their superiority by the sheer force of nature. "I don't have a daily rate for saving foolish men from their own toys," Elias called back over the rain, "but I'll do it, on one condition." "What?" Ethan asked eagerly. "When I hook my chain to that yellow plastic toy of yours," Elias said, his eyes hard and serious, "you tell your boy in the cab to take his hands off the controls. No software, no AI, no help. Just dead weight. I don't want your computer fighting my iron." James hesitated, the idea of relinquishing all control to a century-old machine terrifying his data-driven mind. But he looked at the sinking cat, then nodded slowly. "Deal." Elias smiled around his pipe. "All right then, let's show you boys what real metal can do." Elias Thorne did not rush. While the two young engineers practically vibrated with nervous energy on the edge of the expanding mud pit, the old man operated on a timeline dictated by coal, water, and thermodynamics. He navigated the Hungry Oak through a wide gap in the old stone wall, steering the massive machine onto the compacted gravel staging area that Apex Development had laid down weeks prior. The gravel crunched loudly beneath the wide, steel-straked wheels. James Cole watched from beneath a large golf umbrella, his tablet safely tucked inside his waterproof jacket. He had discreetly pulled out his smartphone and run a quick search on 1920 Fowler steam tractors. The results had not improved his mood. "Ethan," James hissed, leaning close to the site manager, "I just looked up the specs. That thing is rated at 10 nominal horsepower. 10. My riding lawnmower has more horsepower than that. This is a complete waste of time. He's going to snap an axle and then sue us for damages." Ethan, whose eyes were fixed on the 50-ton yellow cat, slowly being swallowed by the Oakhaven clay, shook his head. "Look at the size of that flywheel, James. Look at the gearing. I don't care what the internet says. If he thinks he can do it, let him try. What's our alternative? Wait for the rain to stop in July?" Elias brought the Fowler to a halt about 60 feet away from the trapped excavator. He didn't just park it. He positioned it with geometric precision, aligning the rear of the tractor directly with the towing eyelet buried somewhere beneath the front of the cat. He engaged the heavy handbrake, a solid iron lever that locked the massive rear wheels in place. Then, Elias began his ritual. He climbed down from the footplate, ignoring the driving rain that instantly plastered his gray hair to his forehead. He walked around to the tender, pulling a long, heavy iron poker from its brackets. Opening the firebox door, he unleashed a wave of intense, dry heat that pushed back the damp chill of the afternoon. He stoked the glowing bed of Welsh coal, breaking up clinkers and ensuring maximum airflow. He shoveled in 3 more precise loads, the black rocks vanishing into the roaring orange maw. Next, he meticulously checked the brass sight glass, verifying the boiler water level. He picked up an oil can with a long curved spout, moving around the engine to lubricate the eccentric strap, the crosshead guides, and the massive main bearings. Every movement was deliberate, practiced over decades. "Does he think we have all day?" James muttered, looking at his Rolex. "He's making sure it doesn't blow up," Ethan replied flatly. "Let the man work." Satisfied with the engine's vital signs, Elias walked to the back of the tractor. Mounted between the rear wheels was a massive winch drum, coiled with thick, heavy-duty wire rope that ended in a forged steel hook the size of a man's torso. But for this job, Elias knew the wire rope wouldn't be enough. He reached into the wooden toolbox mounted on the side of the tender and dragged out a length of chain. It was a marine-grade anchor chain, the kind used to secure dreadnoughts to the ocean floor. Each link was 1.5 inches thick, forged from black iron, coated in a mixture of grease and rust. It hit the wet gravel with a heavy, dead clank that resonated in the chests of the observing engineers. Elias didn't ask for help. He grabbed the end of the chain and walked directly into the quagmire. The mud instantly swallowed his heavy leather boots, sucking at his calves with greedy, wet noises. He waded toward the front of the trapped excavator, the heavy chain dragging behind him, cutting a deep groove in the liquid earth. Inside the cab, Miller watched wide-eyed as the old man, covered in mud and coal dust, waded up to the front tracks. Elias dropped to his knees in the freezing slurry, plunging his arms shoulder-deep into the muck to locate the primary recovery point on the cat's undercarriage. He fished blindly for a few moments, grunting with exertion, before his fingers found the thick steel loop. He fed the massive hook through the eyelet, securing the chain. Rising from the mud, Elias wiped his hands on his already ruined overalls and pointed a single, commanding finger at Miller behind the glass. "Hands in your lap, son," Elias bellowed, his voice carrying easily over the rain. "Do not touch those sticks. If you try to help me, you'll snap my chain and kill us both." Miller swallowed hard, raised both his hands in the air, and nodded frantically. Elias trudged back to the Fowler, leaving a trail of watery brown footprints on the pristine gravel. He hooked the other end of the marine chain to the heavy drawbar of his steam tractor. He then did something that finally made James Cole pay close attention. Elias pulled 2 heavy steel pins from the hubs of the massive rear wheels, disconnecting the drive mechanism from the wheels themselves. He then engaged a heavy dog clutch that connected the engine directly to the winch drum. He wasn't going to try and drive forward to pull the cat. He was going to use the Fowler as a stationary, 50-ton anchor, using the engine's raw power to reel the excavator in. "He's using a winch system," James noted, his analytical mind finally grasping the mechanical advantage. "He's eliminated the variable of wheel slip on the gravel. He's transferring 100% of the engine's output directly to the cable." Elias climbed back onto the footplate. The rain hissed as it hit the hot boiler jacket, sending up clouds of white steam that mingled with the dark gray smoke churning from the tall chimney. He checked the pressure gauge one last time. The needle was hovering dead on 150 psi, the red line. The engine was practically vibrating with stored kinetic energy. Elias gripped the brass handle of the regulator. He looked back over his shoulder, ensuring the chain was clear and straight. He locked eyes with James and Ethan for a split second. There was no arrogance in the old man's gaze, only the quiet, absolute certainty of iron and fire. He pulled the regulator open. The Fowler didn't roar like a diesel. It didn't scream or whine. It took a deep, concussive breath. Chuff! A massive plume of black smoke shot straight up into the rain. The huge flywheel, weighing over half a ton, began to turn, slowly at first, gathering momentum. The gears of the winch drum engaged with a heavy, metallic groan. The marine chain lifted from the mud, pulling perfectly straight. The links creaked under the sudden, immense tension, squeezing water out from between the iron joints. Chuff, chuff. The exhaust note deepened, becoming a physical force that vibrated in the soles of the engineer's boots. Elias kept his hand on the regulator, feeding just enough steam to the massive single cylinder to maintain pressure without breaking traction. He was feeling the load through the steel of the machine. The chain was now as rigid as a steel beam. The front of the Fowler dipped slightly as the winch took the full, dead weight of the 50-ton excavator, plus the incalculable suction of the blue clay. Nothing happened. For 10 agonizing seconds, the tableau was frozen. The steam tractor barked, the fire spat from the chimney, the chain trembled, and the yellow cat remained entombed. "It's not enough," James whispered, a knot forming in his stomach. "The vacuum seal is too strong. The clay is holding it." On the footplate, Elias didn't panic. He didn't suddenly jam the throttle wide open. He understood the physics of the Earth better than any algorithm. He knew that to break a vacuum, you didn't need a sudden jerk of speed. You needed relentless, sustained, unbreakable torque. He nudged the regulator a fraction of an inch further. Bark, bark, bark! The exhaust notes became sharp, violent explosions. The Fowler was delivering its maximum rotational force. The ground beneath the heavy iron wheels visibly compacted. The chain groaned, a high-pitched, terrifying sound of metal being stretched to its absolute molecular limit. Then, a sound echoed across the valley. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was the deep, resonant, sickening schluck of the earth surrendering. "Look!" Ethan yelled, pointing frantically. The nose of the cat excavator suddenly pitched upward by a fraction of an inch. The liquid mud around the tracks bubbled furiously as air was finally sucked down into the vacuum pocket beneath the chassis. Elias felt the subtle shift in resistance. He didn't let up. He held the pressure steady, letting the massive flywheel do its work, maintaining the brutal, unrelenting pull. Inch by agonizing inch, the 50-ton marvel of modern engineering was dragged backward. The mud fought for every millimeter, clinging to the yellow paint, refusing to let go of its prize. But the Fowler was oblivious to the struggle. It simply turned its drum, reeling in the massive chain with the cold, unfeeling inevitability of a glacier. As the excavator moved, it dragged a tidal wave of thick brown sludge with it. Miller, still sitting in the cab with his hands raised, looked like a passenger on a slow-motion shipwreck. Slowly, the tops of the steel tracks breached the surface of the mud. Then the drive sprockets. The cat was carving a massive trench as it was pulled backward, but it was moving. It was no longer sinking, it was sliding. "He's doing it," James breathed, his eyes wide, completely ignoring the rain soaking his shoulders. "I don't believe it. The gear reduction, the torque multiplier, the sheer mass of the anchor." His mind was racing, furiously calculating the physical forces at play, suddenly realizing that the formulas he had learned in university were currently being rewritten in front of him by a man who smelled like a blacksmith's apron. It took 10 full minutes of deafening, ground-shaking effort, 10 minutes of the steam tractor roaring against the storm, but finally the rear tracks of the cat found the buried edge of the gravel staging mat. With a final, desperate heave, the Fowler dragged the front of the excavator up and out of the clay pit. The heavy yellow machine settled onto the solid stone, safe, secure, and completely covered from the undercarriage to the cab windows in a thick, smelly layer of gray-blue muck. Elias instantly slammed the regulator shut. The sudden silence was deafening, leaving only the ringing in the engineer's ears and the steady drum of the rain. The Fowler let out a long, exhausted hiss from its safety valve, a cloud of white steam enveloping the old man on the footplate. Elias engaged the drum brake, locked the gears, and slowly climbed down. He walked over to the chain, entirely unbothered by the fact that he looked like he had just wrestled a swamp monster. He unhooked the massive steel loop from his drawbar, letting it drop to the gravel. James and Ethan walked slowly toward him. The arrogance that had characterized their demeanor all week was entirely gone, washed away by the rain and the undeniable display of raw, mechanical supremacy. James looked at the mud-caked excavator, then at the hissing, radiating beast of dark iron that had saved it. He reached up and slowly took off his hard hat, running a hand through his wet hair. "Mr. Thorne," James started, his voice lacking its usual sharp, authoritative edge. He cleared his throat. "Elias, I owe you an apology." Elias pulled a rag from his pocket and began wiping the grease from his hands, though it did little good. He looked at James, his pale blue eyes calm and unreadable. Your machine, James continued, gesturing to the $500,000 cat, has all the sensors in the world. It can tell me the exact moisture content of the soil down to 0.1%. It can automatically adjust hydraulic pressure based on GPS topography. But it couldn't tell me what that blue clay would do once the chassis settled. James looked back at the Fowler. Your tractor, it doesn't have a single microchip, but you knew exactly what to do. Sensors are fine things, son, Elias said, pulling his briar pipe from his pocket and tapping it against his palm. They tell you what is happening, but they don't tell you how the earth feels. They don't have weight. They don't have grip. When you're dealing with mud, you don't need a computer to think about it. You need iron that's too heavy to care. Ethan stepped forward, extending a hand. You saved our schedule, Elias, and probably a few jobs, including ours. We'd have been explaining a $500,000 write-off to the board tomorrow. Elias looked at the offered hand, then at his own grease-blackened palm, and finally shook it firmly. Just returning the favor for the noise you boys have been making all month. Figured I'd show you how a real machine sounds. James pulled out his tablet. It was still covered in a plastic waterproof sleeve. He tapped the screen a few times, bringing up the project budget. We have 3 more sectors to grade, James said, his tone shifting from humbled to professional. And looking at the long-term forecast, the rain isn't going to stop anytime soon. We have a fleet of dozers and dump trucks coming in on Monday. They are going to get stuck. It is mathematically inevitable at this point. James looked up from the screen, meeting Elias's eyes. The project has a contingency fund for heavy recovery and specialized site logistics. I want to put you in that The Hungry Oak on retainer for the duration of the earth-moving phase. You name your day rate. If a machine gets bogged down, you're our first call. We don't try to dig it out. We don't bring in other modern equipment. We call you. Elias paused, striking a waterproof match against the side of his tender and holding the flame to his pipe. He puffed a few times, getting the tobacco going, the sweet smoke cutting through the smell of diesel and mud. He looked out over the sprawling, ruined landscape of his former neighbors' farms, now destined to be manicured lawns and paved driveways. He couldn't stop the future from coming, but maybe, he thought, he could make sure the future remembered where it came from. $50 an hour, Elias said around the stem of his pipe, and you provide the coal, Welsh anthracite, not that cheap bituminous dust, and your boys stay out of my way when I'm rigging a chain. Done, James said without hesitation. It was a fraction of what a commercial recovery service would charge, and infinitely more reliable. Elias nodded, turning back to his machine. All right then, I suggest you boys go get dry. I've still got an oak tree to pull off my fence line. He climbed back onto the footplate of the 1920 Fowler. As he opened the regulator and the massive machine began its slow, rhythmic chuff-chuff-chuff back toward the stone wall, James and Ethan stood in the rain and watched. They didn't see an antique anymore. They saw the undisputed king of Oak Haven County, a master of torque and traction, rolling back to its domain. The engineers finally understood that sometimes the most advanced solution to a problem was forged in a fire 100 years ago.